So this is the third of meetings we started a couple of years ago when we realized that we've quite a lot of overlap in our research and that it would be interesting to benefit from each other's findings and insights. And now that we both groups have come out with the final results, we thought that would be a great opportunity to not only discuss that among ourselves, but also discuss it with you. And we're very happy that you're here to just see like how is that actually perceived from a policy perspective, what could be done with those findings that we've done. And the idea for the NFG was to really show that you can bridge academic research at university with policy recommendation, that it's not an either or approach, but basically that the university might provide some tools for some in-depth analysis. Think tanks probably sometimes don't get hold on, and on the other side, the policy side might make that research more relevant from a policy perspective. We've got two parts today. We will start at the NFG to discuss our research. I will make a short presentation, and then we provided 3 sets of recommendations, and we would like to use the time with you to discuss those recommendations. Just share them with you then. And then we will swap, and then GBBI will take over and do their part. I will do the presentation in terms of time, but then for the Q&A, of course, the whole NFG will join in because they were the ones who went to India, to China to do the interviews. NFG, we just discussed that, has several meanings. Until recently, we thought it probably would be for like not funded group anymore, but that has changed. It just said like we got a new follow-up project now where we will do a tender for the EU Commission to work on the EU perception from outside, where we can actually use our findings again to make that a bit more systematic. But I think for today, it should stand for do not forget Garima, because Garima is with us in spirit, of course. She's got pretty high fever, and we get our finger crossed that that's going to go down today. But we think health probably matters a little bit more than a presentation. So let's get started. Does Europe matter? Security in the Asian century. Basically, our core argument is that, no surprise, the EU is not seen as a security actor, but what we found is that actually the pool of expertise and templates that the EU has on offer is sought after. And we looked at India and China in our case studies. We also found out that personal exposure, interaction, and fitting templates are the key for those strategic partners, India and China, to adopt European templates, but that perceptions and history matter much less. And that was interesting because a lot of people said we've got a colonial history there. We're not seen as an actor, da-di-da-di-da, therefore we cannot be active. And we actually found out that there's quite a gap between the discourse and the action. Points of influences that we could identify are primarily through training, through know-how transfer. They are limited, but they are effective. So this idea of the EU in terms of like persuasion, communication, socialization, but particularly just offering training and by the member states does have an effect. What we could see for the EU basically is that the EU could push for frameworks, so for overarching frameworks, for overarching templates, while the member states then actually implement the concrete action, so that there is this division of labor between both sides. Challenges not as a surprise, of course, resources, coordination, absorbing capacity, but the interesting thing is that particularly the first one actually goes to the receiving state. So we realized that the absorptive capacity, particularly in India, was one of the main hurdles for diffusion. So it was not reservation, but actually the ability to interact just down to human resources. 5 short points, just really introducing us, the research model that we based our research on, the case studies, but then focusing particularly on our findings and the recommendations. The NFG is like most of us are around the table, so we're an international interdisciplinary research team with about 10 members. We have an India cluster, a China cluster, and we've got 2 case studies that we focus on peacekeeping operations and export control regimes as the 2 most tangible parts of the European security policy when acting with third partners abroad. So you see us here in a short overview. As you might probably have noticed, we have our king among ourselves, Chicho Chao. Apparently from that we only women. That shows that women do play a security role. That is our research model, the idea about diffusion of policies. That is based on social science research, which basically analyze under which condition diffusion takes place. Diffusion means basically that a norm, a paradigm, best practices goes from one side to the other without being forced or forced upon the other side by, for example, if states want to access the European Union, they have to implement the acquis communautaire. Diffusion just happens by different mechanisms. And then you have on the one side the direct mechanisms. Direct means from the, in this so-called sender to the recipient. Of course, there's always back and forth in diffusion, but in our case, we looked at the European Union as the sender, India-China as the so-called recipients. Direct would be engagements, common training, working together, persuasion, influence, while indirect mechanisms are competition, like between India and China. I want to be as good as they are in this field. Lesson drawing, like you need to find a solution, you see this actually works. Or mimicry, you basically pretend you do this, but it only looks like it. And what we wanted to see is when you see at the European Union, they have these policies that they try to promote, and on the other side you have India and China as the strategic partners. We wanted to find out what are actually the factors in between that either facilitate, enhance, or prevent adoption, adaptation, and rejection. And we identified several of them: culture, translation, history, training, education, political context, democracy, non-democracy, perceptions probably being a key idea about how the EU doesn't matter, why should we bother. We looked at peacekeeping and export controls. This is just a short overview about peacekeeping, which shows that India, of course, is one of the oldest troop contributing and one of the biggest troop contributing countries, being currently involved in 12 missions, but also China being involved currently in 9 missions, and this is a tendency that is increasing. On the area of export controls, this is just a short map about China's and India's membership, particularly or respectively aspiration for membership in international arms control regimes, non-proliferation regimes. And it shows that China actually has been signing up to quite a few, and that is a clear deviation from the initial starting point of India and China of non-alignment, of neutrality, of non-interference, and this whole signing up to international regimes is quite a change, and we see that is the tendency on both sides. The actors we identified in decision making, peacekeeping, and export controls are listed here. We made those in red, who are actually are those we did most interviews with. You can see that particularly in China, it's been quite challenging to get access to the political side, so we spoke to quite a lot of think tanks, but also we spoke to Ministry of Commerce, to small, to state-owned enterprises, to MOFCOM, so we got quite an access there, while in India it was a bit easier to get access to the political level. Just a short overview of the actors interviewed. You can see that are primarily, of course, think tank and academics, but also ministries. Also because of the people involved, it's just not as many people on the government side in our specific cases which are involved. Interesting probably also might be that most of them had an exposure to Europe or the United States, and just a minor part of 10% was never been abroad, which we showed later on actually was one of the key aspects for implementing templates from outside. Shortly, decision making, because he thought that is the most important thing to find out what actually is the decision making, and therefore what could be points of influence for the EU. So in the India case, the final say in peacekeeping rests with the national consultation, while in China the final say is with the Chinese the Central Military Commission, and the points of influence for the EU in India is only in the last part, which we thought is quite interesting, because actually the decision is already done, and only at the training part where the EU could have some influence. While on the Chinese side, there are several aspects, starting with already the beginning, the negotiation of the mandate. Export controls, you can see that point of influence, and in Indian case is at the customs departments, but then China is also the customs inspection, so that both goes to training, and BAFRA has been quite active in that outreach project. Major findings. Basically what we did find, although there is a lot of say that the EU plays no role, actually there is an exchange of paradigms of best practices in security policy, and we looked really at hard security, like very traditional security aspects. We found out, and that will come later, that actually in the area of non-traditional disaster management, terrorism, cyber, there are even much more areas where they start interaction. We find out that perceptions don't really matter, but it's much more about policy shopping. So India and China are emerging actors who need new solutions fast. And they don't have the time to go through their own development circle to find any of them. They also don't want to put the resources, but they basically go around and see what are policies that are actually quite useful. And what we found out is that the European Union is quite interesting precisely because it doesn't have a coordinated approach, because it gives a lot of access to information. It is not, there isn't the assumption that the EU has a policy to, I don't know, topple the regime, to make that very, very explicit, but that there is much more a diffused influence and therefore there's less of a threat. But also that in the EU you have different levels of development, which is interesting, for example, for China, depending like what kind of sector there, for example, the PLA are focusing at, they find countries within the European Union who are at the same development level or are in the same process. So it's basically a very rich pool of expertise. Secondly, what the EU also offers is the institutionalization of processes, which is interesting if you want to introduce something wholesale into your system. And thirdly, it's really templates, like the EU munition list is a really hot seller for the EU, where they could basically integrate all their export control regimes in one list. And they do already the work, so India has just integrated that in its own integration wholesale, because they save a lot of work, basically. Conditions for that we find out is that the need to find solution fast, so urgency is very important. Garima wrote an interesting PhD on the introduction of EU templates in environmental law, and then she found out that if the urgency isn't too fast, it's not adopted, right? Because then a lot of people think, oh, we could probably do this or this and this. So urgency plays a role. The fit of templates, of course, that fits to the area it should be applied. The accessibility, so basically that you get access to them. So the training is an essential part, and the knowledge that you actually know that they exist, that you know that these opportunities are out there. To break that down into our two case studies, peacekeeping side, examples of diffusion that we found, and of course they are quite limited. So they're not major breakthroughs, but diplomacy doesn't make major breakthroughs either, right? So it's just to show that actually there are some points to get started. Of course, area of anti-piracy as a new area, relatively new area for cooperation, is an example. The training of peacekeepers, the evacuation of overseas citizens, and the last thing, of course, shows you about Libya. So there was a very urgent need to find a solution, and then you just look around, how do others, and that what would probably be fitting. India and the anti-piracy, this limited cooperation, they more focus on counterinsurgency and on new challenges. Because peacekeeping traditionally, of course, they say we have so many decades of experience, so don't come and tell us. Export control regime, they're just getting really serious. They're more on the mimicry side so far, they're just now getting serious, if they will be. But in those new areas. Commonalities between both sides. Peacekeeping is seen as part of being an international actor, so a similar approach to that. Principles such as non-interference, host party concepts, changing policy and R2P, and I'm sure that you will talk more about that. There's an increasing cooperation, particularly in the anti-piracy missions, and both are quite wary of NATO and EU missions because it's a bit difficult to picture what actually is the purpose of NATO and EU, and if there might be any hidden agenda to that. Differences. On the China side, the contribution is increasing since the 1990s. So agenda and interest in exposure to foreign militaries and access to know-how is quite a key point. As China is not part of any international, like apart from the SCO, but not really of any Western international security alliance, that is a way to get access to know-how to how to do that. And also that they send engineering and medical teams and national contingents. India has, as I said before, a long experience of participating in the UN missions, so there's a lack of interest in learning from the outside, and it's really on very specific things where they have interests. They send combat troops and mixed contingents. Major finding export controls. Some examples. China, for example, the EU-China Arms Control Handbook has been translated into Chinese, so BAFRA has also been quite useful, and India, that there is an acceptance of EU models and that there is an increasing acceptance. So there is quite, and Anya went to India and made some interviews in September, and me as well, that there is an increasing interest in actually going for the EU model. They started out with the US model and are increasingly interested in the EU model, and there you see the EU dual use goods list as used as a model for SCOMET.
Why is that?
Why are they going further to the EU?
Because basically the EU list is the combination of all the other lists, of all the export control regimes lists. So the EU has it created the only comprehensive list, which even the US used as a model. So basically that's sort of integrating all the different lists, and as India wants to be part of the regimes, it's used that model in order to be recognized.
Commonalities, both of them are in the process of developing a national system of export control since the mid-2000s. The access to high technology is a key driver, aiming for the recognition as a responsible global player, and the training of custom officers happens in both, although in India the EU side hasn't been enacted. So that's why I said that's a really recent phenomenon. That's something we discussed in September. There, of course, Georgia Tech and the US government has been much more prominent. Differences, China has now been turned into a net exporter of arms, and it pushed the United Kingdom from the number 5 of arms exporters last year. It's a member of the NSG and the SEGA committee, and it actually enjoys different levels of cooperations with Europe on export controls. While India is a net importer of arms, and the highest importer of arms, right, worldwide. And but it does aspire to build up its own defense industry. Modi has this very ambitious plans. It's going to be a long way still, but the ambition is there. It's not a member of multilateral export control regimes. It actually feels quite discriminated by particularly the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it despises increasing harmonization, and that is also under the Modi government very recently that they said that they do want to harmonize ever closer to actually finally access them, and it has less exchange in the export control. Finally, perception and practice, because we started out with like saying, oh, the perception as the EU doesn't matter, and we thought it might be interesting to show you the differences. Okay, no surprise, EU is seen mainly as an economic power, so more than 90% said that. Also that the EU is not seen as a unitary political actor, not seen as an effective security actor, that the member states are more important is almost 50%, but still under 50%. And that the EU is most seen as the most important security actor, over 50%, doesn't come as a surprise. What came as a surprise that colonial legacies, cultural proximity in the political system do not determine actual cooperation practice. So India cooperated much less than China, although China is a one-party system, probably culturally maybe a bit more different, you might say, and probably with all the other factors, but it doesn't really matter so much. Differences. China is much more concerned about the euro crisis, so with more than 90%, of course, as they have a lot of their reserves in euro. The EU is seen as a source of best practices, exchanges and trainings, and that what we also thought is interesting, that there's a general openness to integrate external policies and ideas. So there was much less anxiety of being shaped by the outside in a direction they didn't want. There was much more openness, and the idea that, of course, our China people are probably not so surprised about this, you can learn from the Bavarians without turning into the Bavarians, and so the idea that you can actually... No, Bavarians. Yes.
Just checking.
Yeah, you've got 3 Bavarians here, just, you know, for your information, 4. So, and so basically, I guess that is something which also, I guess, needs just more attention in research and hasn't really been so much looked at. India didn't really see the euro crisis as so relevant, and there was the expectation that the EU has to change its system according to Indian needs. So pride and protectionism of national achievements plays a big role, and there was quite often to say, actually, you know, we will join, but only if you become the way we like. So there's a little, I would say, still quite a big part of illusionism in India. Challenges for cooperation on the EU member state side. Small capacities for interaction, so just not enough people for interaction. There's almost no institutionalization and platforms for interaction, so that doesn't come as a surprise. Lack of specialists, short postings of EU bureaucrats in different departments, that also goes for member states, right? So we have in Germany the generalist principle where you go to Shanghai and then you go to Hungary and then you go back to Berlin and work on the United Kingdom. So it is not really used very efficiently. On the so-called recipient side, India and China, for us, the most interesting thing was really that the main challenges was really bureaucratic hurdles and absorptive capacity. In India, you have 83 in the army side. You've got 83 foreign defense attaches for the army, which meet 12 Indian counterparts. So you can just make the math. It just cannot talk a lot. You only have 700 people in the Indian Foreign Ministry, so just by that, there is just a real bottleneck for interaction. Mistrust and wish of non-interference in internal matters, particularly in the Indian side, much more expressed than in the Chinese side, but also, of course, in the Chinese side present. That there are different types of peacekeeping operations which also limit cooperation. So we've got limited missions, particularly like ceasefire monitoring, the principle of no violation of state sovereignty, only by invitation of the host country. And then also the perception that Libya and Syria impacted heavily on the reputations of EU member states, and R2P comes back into the game. And then particularly in the India, or only in the India case, the feeling that export control regimes have quite a discriminatory character. So that was put forward as a hurdle. So that would be our presentation. Thanks very much.